Hey, welcome back to Spellbound. I'm BJ the Book Witch, and this is my February wrap-up. This lip gloss gets so sticky. It's like it wants to stick my mouth together. I just need to scrub this off. I could have easily gotten a napkin. Okay, so I read a lot of books in February. Still not as many as I wanted to read, but I'm doing my best. But my point is we've just got a lot of ground to cover, so we're just gonna jump right in. So my thriller from last month was They All Fall Down by Rachel Howzell Hall. This is a retelling of And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. So there are 7 strangers, they're on a deserted island, and they're under the premise of shooting a reality TV show competition. And one by one, they all start either disappearing or dying under very strange and tragic circumstances. So I rated this 3.5 stars, and this is exactly why Goodreads needs half stars. Do you hear me, Goodreads? You need half stars. Because the plot was super entertaining, and it had really distinguishable characters, which was nice, especially in a book like this. And it had an unreliable narrator, which I really enjoyed reading, and I feel was done very well. But the pacing was so inconsistent between the two halves of the book. The first half was a great build, a great ramp up to what would be this very suspenseful climax. But as soon as you hit the last turning point of the book and you start to get down to the main suspects of everything, plot moves so fast, the climax moves so fast that you don't really get the real and impactful ending that I think the book wanted to have. I think that they tried for a very bold and surprising twist ending, and I think that would have landed much better if the entire second half of the book wasn't so rushed. So because of that, it really felt like you were reading 2 different books. But if you're a fan of thrillers, I would still recommend it. In middle grade, I read The Mysterious Messenger by Gilbert Ford. So Maria is the daughter of a con artist who poses as a psychic in Brooklyn, helping old widows connect with their long deceased spouses. Maria does not enjoy helping her mother in this line of work because Maria has a secret, and that secret is that she actually can communicate with the dead through automatic writing. And through the course of this book, Maria and her spirit friend are led on a treasure hunt interwoven with real history of the New York beat poets, and through this journey, Maria comes to discover what it is that she truly values. 5 stars. It was fast-paced, it was charming, it had very rich and colorful characters, which I love reading in middle grade. Specifically, the mom character, she just leaps off the page. She was very reminiscent of Madame Medusa from The Rescuers, and it had a unique plot and very heartwarming themes of friendship and family. Definitely recommend. In lit fiction, I read The 12 Tribes of Hattie by Ayana Mathis. So this is the story of Hattie as told through the perspectives of her 12 children. So the setup is almost like interwoven short stories that all show different glimpses into Hattie's character, all at different points within the 20th century. So it's not in chronological order. And together they tell a story of escape, freedom, identity, and resentment. So they come together to create this portrait of Hattie as an individual and as a character, as well as the character of the United States itself as a country, as it struggles with these same concepts and themes throughout its lifetime, but especially in the 20th century as well. I gave it 5 stars. It was extremely beautiful and extremely heartbreaking. Highly recommend. Very good book. So last month was February and Valentine's Day, and I read a lot of romance. So a lot of romance coming at ya. We'll get through it together. In fantasy romance, I read A Deal with the Elf King by Elise Kova. So in this world, there is a divide and a barrier between the natural world and Midscape, which is a land inhabited by elves and fairies and other junk. And this divide is beginning to fade, and it's causing harm to both sides, to both worlds. So Luella agrees to make a deal with the Elf King from Midscape to become his wife, and that somehow magically strengthens the barrier between worlds. And they both really hate this arrangement and kind of each other, so they work together throughout the course of the book to find alternative solutions to this centuries-old tradition that will last longer. Whatever. 2 stars, man. 2 stars. This book was very inconsistent in its tone and writing style, changing frequently from very fast-paced action to over-the-top lyrical and poetic language, especially during romantic scenes. The entirety of the world building is done through expository dialogue, which further adds to the mechanical clunkiness of the book. This story introduced concepts that were pretty interesting and intriguing and possibly plot altering, only to completely abandon them and never revisit them again. Like the issue of her name. Maybe her name is not Luella at all, and maybe it's something completely different and very important, except not at all, because we don't revisit it again ever. So despite the overwhelming simplicity of this plot, the book as a whole was very confusing. So the first of several contemporary romances is The Wedding Date by Jasmine Guillory. So Drew is a groomsman in his ex's wedding, long story, and the night before this wedding, he meets Alexa in an elevator and she agrees on a whim to be his date for the wedding. They quickly realize they've got a lot of chemistry, so they agree to see each other after the wedding. But after several dates and no real commitment, Alexa is starting to wonder if maybe she's not just experiencing a very extended one-night stand. So I gave this one 4 stars. It was a perfectly cute, light and fluffy contemporary romance, and the author did a really good job of including some important conversations between this interracial couple. Another contemporary romance was The Roommate by Rosie Danan. So this is about an East Coast old money socialite who drops everything to move in for the summer with her longtime best friend and crush. But when she gets there, he's on his way out, going on tour for the entire summer with his band, and he leaves her the house and one frustratingly charming roommate who turns out to be a porn star. So I gave this one 4.5 stars. Goodreads might not give half stars, but I do. It was cute and fast-paced, and it was delightfully and refreshingly sex-positive, which I appreciated. The characters were well-developed with very rich backstories, which was nice, and the dialogue was very realistic, probably the best writing that I've encountered within these contemporary romances that I've been reading. The tension between the two main characters was wound really tight, which was nice, but for that, it was even more disappointing at the climax, which was completely flat and disappointing. So still really well written, still would recommend it, still a very cute contemporary romance. The next contemporary romance is The Hating Game by Sally Thorne, and I think they're making a movie of this one. So this is your classic enemies to lovers office romance. Lucy hates her colleague Joshua, and their rivalry, which is mostly made up of petty pranks and office quips, reaches its tipping point whenever they both enter in for the same promotion. And along the way, they start to appreciate and fall for each other. So I gave this one 4 stars, but it was like a fine 4 stars. Not like 4 stars. It was just like, fine. Other people would probably really enjoy it. I didn't, but it was fine. It was well paced, it was decently written, and the tension stays tight between the two main characters. The characters are stereotypical, but they're written in a way that's not entirely unlikable, and the author gives them opportunities to briefly overcome their own stereotypes, which is nice. Big fat, however, the protagonist was often infantilized to the point of nausea and described on more than one or a few occasions as being some derivation of impossibly small. Often adopted the speech patterns and behavior of a very small and whiny child, and it was not cute and it was not fun to read. It was very weird. So if you can look beyond that, where I couldn't, then fine. It is a cute, light, and fluffy romance. The last contemporary romance that I read was Beach Read by Emily Henry. This is about a romance writer who has lost her belief in love and moves next door to a cynical writer of literary fiction. So this would be like a 3.75. I mean, it's rounding up to 4, fine, but like low 4. Because it wasn't even a light and fluffy romance, and personally, I didn't even enjoy reading this. Unlike what the title suggests, this is not a light and fluffy romance. This is not a beach read. This book covers everything from death, grief, divorce, infidelity, cancer, to the general dissatisfaction with life and the illusion of happily ever afters. So do with that what you will. Okay, but then I read These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong, and this is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet set in 1920s Shanghai. So this book is rich and super politically charged, very intelligent, very poignant. It's about 2 rival gangs struggling for survival in a changing landscape, and it's the story of cultural identity, political intrigue, the fate of first loves, and an actual monster plaguing their hometown. It is the classic tale of love and doom with new resonant undertones of the conflict between Eastern tradition and Western entitlement, and the delicious tension found within an environment that relies so heavily on violence. I loved this book. 5 out of 5. It took me forever to read it because I wanted to capture every single word. I took my time with this book. So with beautiful imagery and prose, Shanghai is on the cusp of a new identity, weaving together these tragic and pretty complex characters into this incredible crescendo. Honestly, my only downside was that this book ended on kind of a cliffhanger, which was fine, like as a book. It just means that I have to wait now to read the rest of it for the sequel, which I think comes out in November. Just a great book. I realized I was like 100 pages out, and I was sitting there and I was like, oh no, because I knew it. I knew there'd be no way to wrap this up in 100 pages, and I was like, oh no. I really thought that it was a standalone, so it really just threw me. And then when I realized that it was the end of the story, but it wasn't the end, I pitched a whole fit, like a whole ass fit. I was so mad, not because I was frustrated with the book, but because I was so frustrated with the book, because I wanted more. I wanted so much more, and it's really good. And actually, they do a really good job with Romeo and Juliet because it is the same story and not the same story. Hang on, my nose is running, so just like hang on a second. Let me like dab. Allergies, man, am I right? So this book does a really good job with Romeo and Juliet, I thought, because this is not the romance of Romeo and Juliet. Their romance, their like star-crossed romance, has already happened by the time this book starts. It happened 4 or 5 years ago, in fact. So they got all that like super hormone-charged angst out of the way, because they're like the heirs to these rival gangs. So this is not so much this like angst-filled story, but this very like resolute, they have resigned themselves to their roles, and they are already clear-cut enemies. Their romance is in the past, it is behind them, and it is a source of great tension for them. Absolutely. And obviously there's still Romeo and Juliet, so it's not like there's nothing there. But that sets the stage for something to be much more real and authentic, and also so much more powerful. More than anything, I loved this because their whole thing is very much not in the foreground of this story. It is very much in the background. The foreground of this story is Shanghai and its identity and what's happening to it and what's happening to the gang lords within it. And it's just brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And it's so deliciously violent, I can't even tell you. So I think I've mentioned it a couple of times. I don't care for romance, but I do care for violence. And specifically, if there is a romance, I enjoy it when there's violence involved. And this satisfied them all, checked all those boxes. Honestly, favorite book of the month, can't recommend it enough. 5 out of 5. In middle grade, I read Hoodoo by Ronald L. Smith. So, Hoodoo Hatcher, can't conjure, despite belonging to a long line of hoodoo practitioners. And it's a sore spot for him. But when he receives a warning from a crow about a mysterious stranger coming to town, Hoodoo realizes he may have to take matters into his own hands anyway. 5 stars. Immersed in Southern folk magic and culture and tradition, this book was full of magic and danger and a lot of heart. Honestly, it was a quick read, and I highly recommend it, and I can't wait to read more of his work. A YA fantasy romance that I read last month was Kingdom of the Wicked by Carrie Maniscalco. So in this book, Emilia has been warned her entire life to fear the wicked, and these are the 7 princes of hell, and they're related to the 7 deadly sins. And this is all due to a forgotten prophecy. And Emilia fully intends on heeding her grandmother's warnings until one day when her twin sister is brutally murdered after summoning a demon. So with the help of her own demon, bound to her by a dark spell, she tries to solve her sister's murder and uncover the truth behind an ancient curse. 3.5 stars. This book had all the things: witches, magic, curses, spells, monasteries, demons, and a wicked enemies to lovers setup. It's set in Sicily, which is really cool. And the culture is there, and that setting and that atmosphere, it's really rich. The pacing, it was jarring, and it felt really clunky. She wakes up, she consults her demon calls her a dummy, and then she goes somewhere completely new, meets that demon, an entire chapter of exposition, and they explain, you don't know what you're doing because of little piece of the puzzle. She takes that little piece of the puzzle back home to her demon. He says, you're a dummy, you'll never figure it out, and then she wakes up and she does it all over again. It was the most Scooby-Doo routine I've ever seen, and nothing ended up mattering. Like, none of the things that she ended up discovering ended up mattering whatsoever, because there were huge entire pieces of the puzzle that nobody was telling her. She wasn't finding out on her own, and then just came into knowledge right there at the climax. And let's talk about that climax. None of it made a lick of sense. I literally had to read it 3 different times just to understand the mechanics of what had happened. And ultimately, I still left confused. So I am eagerly awaiting the sequel, and I'm hoping that Carrie Maniscalco will slow the F down and explain what's going on, explain what happened, explain a little bit more behind the characters that we don't know and their own motivations, because right now it just seems like they're all on autopilot, just kind of trying to move forward to the plot that she already has in her head. So we don't really know who's doing stuff or why, at all, for any of the characters. I'm hoping that that will come into more light in the sequel. All the ingredients are there. Another middle grade that I read was Blended by Sharon M. Draper. 11-year-old Isabella navigates her biracial identity and her parents' divorce. So settle in, because I have thoughts. So I gave this book 2.5 stars. So this book had no real plot and was just a series of meandering diary-like entries and observations from an 11-year-old who, through more than 85% of the book, adopted speech patterns more common in 7 or 8-year-olds than 11-year-olds. This book touches and hints at racism, microaggressions, and even police brutality, and then quickly shies away from them. Does not dwell on them for more than a moment. Isabella is never able to show any emotional maturity, depth of character, or even any real growth from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. She is made up entirely of outdated references and way too many exclamation points to be taken seriously. This book had every opportunity to introduce these very difficult and important topics in a way that gives credit to the protagonist, and more importantly, to its readers, who are much more aware of the world than this book implies. Instead, it skews very young and paints middle grade as an extremely naive and unaware age group and audience. Look, man, rule number 1 of middle grade: don't talk down to your audience. Middle graders are capable of big emotions and real depth. This character is written as a perpetually happy-go-lucky and completely unaware character who has somehow never before encountered the very concept of her own biracial identity, which is beyond comprehensible because her mother is white and her father is black. She seems completely flabbergasted by any and all mentions of race. Nobody in the entire book said anything even remotely normal. Not once. There was not a normal sentence or phrase whispered or uttered in the entire book. The main character, again, an 11-year-old, in the year 2019, said things like golly or gee. There's more. So Isabella's friend, another girl of color, has a noose put in her locker at school. The following day at school, the social studies teacher initiates a conversation with the students and asks them all to share their feelings. And I was like, okay, great. This is an opportunity to put into kid language, into 11-year-old language, how they might be processing these feelings. A kid of color in the book raises his hand and says, well, white people, and the social studies teacher interrupts him and says, hey, we don't talk that way in this class. Did I miss something? The teacher initiated this discussion. He said, does anyone want to talk about what just happened, which was a racially motivated threat against a student of color. And as soon as a student of color says something that only begins with white people, the teacher shuts him down as if he has said something wrong. How are you going to initiate a conversation about race without starting with the words white people? That's how you do it. That's how you have the conversation. But that's not even where this ridiculous scene ends. So the students say that they want to do something to make the girl, who has still not yet returned to school, they want to do something to make her feel better. And so the main character, Isabella, she's 11. She says, well, the only way to drive out racism is through love. So she has this idea of peppering the school, the middle school, with construction paper hearts. And the teacher's like, that's a fine idea. Just swell. So they are like, great, that's how we're going to fix racism, is with construction paper hearts. The students say, hey, teach, can we do this instead of social studies work? And he says, sure. And the actual words of the end of that chapter say, Boy, was he relieved. Why was he relieved? They didn't talk about anything. They didn't talk about the fact that a girl had a noose put in her locker. They didn't talk about who put that noose there or why. They didn't talk about how the students of color might be feeling collectively, individually. They didn't talk about how the white kids might be feeling collectively or individually. They didn't talk about anything. They only agreed to cut construction paper hearts and put them over the school because that will drive out racism. It was just so weird. You had a whole ass opportunity to talk about the way that sixth graders might be feeling and expressing it themselves as sixth graders, how they're dealing with a very clear threat against one of their friends, against another kid of color, how they might be feeling. You had a whole opportunity on a platter, and the author directly chose to avoid it. They crossed 4 lanes of traffic to get off on the exit ramp, to actually not have that conversation, and to instead cover it with construction paper hearts. And honestly, this setup happened in the book over and over and over again. Like, there were opportunities like this. Like, that's what I mean, is this book introduced these ideas and these concepts and these moments when they would have been impactful to this 11-year-old. And then they just were like, well, that's the end of that interaction. We certainly don't need to dwell on that anymore. To assume that an 11-year-old of color has never before confronted or even encountered the very concept of their own racial identity is inaccurate and irresponsible. And it does a severe disservice to the 5th and 6th graders who might be reading this book, trying to understand their own feelings and observations and thoughts regarding their own encounters and experiences with racism. For both kids of color and white kids, the age of 11 may very well be the first time that white kids encounter microaggressions and start to see the way that kids are treated differently. Absolutely. But to assume that it's the first time that kids of color experience it is just not true. Okay, that's all. That's all I've got to say. Don't talk down to your audience. Don't talk down to middle graders, especially when you're dealing with something as important as race. The end. We're done. Okay, so I finally finished Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I actually don't even know what category this book belongs in. I don't know if it's YA. I don't know if it's adult. I don't know if it's fantasy. Like, I know that it's dark academia, but like, what does that... I guess that's fantasy. It's not high fantasy. I don't know. But I finally finished it, and it is a dark academia, and it is in fact my first dark academia novel. So Alex Stern can see ghosts, and she attends Yale, and at Yale, dark magic is not uncommon. It's still secret, but it has been divided and specialized by 9 different houses or secret societies. And one night during a ritual, a young woman is murdered on campus, and Alex is thrust into a centuries-old mystery that deals with power, secrets, sex, and consequences. I gave this book 4 stars. So this book took me forever to read, and not because I wanted to sip and savor every word, but because this book is monstrously dense. I felt like I wanted like a companion novel just to explain in layman's terms what the heck was going on. This book does not slow down for exposition. No definitions, no quick aside to the reader, no expository character just to pause and say, so let me get this straight. Like, none of that. This book is so steeped in its own history, its own mythos, and its own way of functioning that it does not do any sort of a setup for the reader. There is no character that's like a newborn fawn stumbling into this world that has things explained to her. So you have to read this slowly or else you will get confused and there will be no opportunity for catch up. Like, there's no amount of skipping or skimming where things will just make more sense later on through context, because even the context is itself rooted in the story. So you have to take your time with this book. But still, this book does say a lot, and not just because it's dense with its own world building, but this book really is an exploration and a sharp critique on long-standing institutions and the fight for justice that women face after far too common experiences of brutality. Another YA fantasy that I read last month was Graceling by Kristen Kishore, and this was the Content Team Book Club's pick of the month. So in this world, people are born with special powers or graces, and Katza, our main character, is born with the grace or the ability to kill people. So she's used as a weapon by her king and sent to other territories or kingdoms to torture or intimidate or kill people. So she believes herself a monster. But when she gets thrown into a mystery involving a kidnapped monarch, Katza has to join forces with another Graceling, and on her journey she discovers what it means to survive and what it means to have freedom. So I give this book 5 out of 5 stars. I really did not expect to love it as much as I did, but I loved it because it really felt like an epic quest, and I love epic quests. So in that way, it really does cover a lot of ground. And in fact, from the sheer amount of plot development, it did kind of feel like 2 different books. However, the writing is really well paced, so it doesn't feel like it lags or jumps or skips ahead. The characters develop at natural paces and they feel really rich and realized, and absolutely this is a journey worth taking. The last book I read was a fiction novel, and it was The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. In her conservative religious village, Emmanuel is, by her very nature, a pariah. Born stained with the sins of her parents, Emmanuel is looked down upon by the prophet and his wives and the rest of the church. But when she accidentally unleashes a curse on the entire town, she goes on a journey to face her heritage and save her home. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. I really did not like this book. This book was beautifully written. It was suspenseful and it was rich. This story does paint a very clear picture of the way that religion and patriarchy and humans in general can corrupt and pervert the purity of the divine. Unfortunately, that wasn't the main struggle for the protagonist. While the author makes it clear that fault lies with the corruption of man, the witches of the forest are still very much the villains to vanquish in this story. And the witches in this story represent the divine mother or the sacred feminine, and the antithesis to the very masculine god that this religious town serves. And spoiler, Emmanuel chooses to save and stay with the religious cult, proving the point of the book unironically with the quote, "To be a woman is to be a sacrifice." You can't make the point that humans corrupt the purity of both sides of divine intentions, the masculine and the feminine, and then still literally kill one of the 2 divine beings. This book ultimately said, yes, humans, and specifically men, have killed and raped children in the name of this masculine god, but it's still way better than those fucking witches over there, what with their wrath and their vengeance and their wily feminine ways. So let's forgive the child rapist, but make sure to kill the divine goddess in the woods, because she's trouble. Which really just felt like an odd sort of apologetic manifesto to me, so I didn't like it. Okay guys, we made it. We made it through 15 books, and if you ask me, I've done enough talking. I want to hear from you. What did you read last month, and what are you reading now? Have you read any of the 15 books that I just mentioned? And if so, what did you think? Did you agree with my ratings and reviews? Do you disagree? Either way, leave me a comment below and tell me what you're reading, tell me what you've read. Thanks so much for sticking around. For more on these books and others, follow me on Instagram. And if you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you loved it, hit subscribe, because I'll be bringing you bookish and witchy content every weekend-ish. And as always, happy reading!